The funeral was on a Tuesday. Gray sky, thin rain, and a casket lowered into the ground like the world wanted it done quietly. No flowers except the cheap ones the funeral home threw in. No family, no eulogy, just me. A priest who didn't know the man, and the neighbor everyone said was dangerous. Then a young lawyer walked up with a trembling hand and an envelope. He said, "Mr. Hartley told me you'd be the only one here." I stayed until the last shovel of dirt hit the casket and the workers drove off, because leaving early felt like repeating the same abandonment that had defined Walter Hartley's entire life. And when the priest offered condolences that sounded like he'd memorized them in seminary, I nodded like I believed him. Then I watched the lawyer approach across wet grass, suit too big, briefcase too old, shoes sinking into mud with every step. And I remember thinking he looked like a man carrying a secret heavier than his spine. He introduced himself as Daniel Patterson, Walter's attorney, and when he said, "I was hoping I'd find you here," my throat tightened because it confirmed what I already knew. I was the only one who came, the only one who stayed, the only one who didn't treat Walter like a stain to erase. And when Daniel handed me the envelope, it wasn't dramatic, it was clinical, like passing a file. But his eyes gave him away. He knew the contents would fracture my life. He knew I couldn't unlearn it. And as I stood there, holding it, rain collecting on the flap, I thought about how absurd it was that a dead man had to send me truth by courier, because the living had spent decades hiding it. My name is Marcus Webb. I'm 41, a high school history teacher in Hartford, divorced, no kids, the kind of man who tells teenagers that history is people and choices and consequences, not just dates. And I've said those words so many times I could say them in my sleep, but I never imagined I'd be forced to live them this literally, because Walter Hartley wasn't just the old man next door. He was the war my parents fought daily for 40 years, and I grew up inside that war like a kid raised in smoke, learning to breathe around rules that never made sense. My parents, Richard and Catherine Webb, hated Walter with a kind of discipline that still scares me to remember. Not annoyance, not dislike, hate that required planning, hate that required effort, hate that shaped our property lines and our routines, and even the way we held our bodies when we stepped outside. They never spoke to him once, not a wave, not a nod, not a good morning. If they saw him near the mailbox, they would turn around mid-step and retreat like he carried disease. If we passed him on the sidewalk while walking our dog, my father would yank the leash so hard the dog would yelp just to get him across the street, as if proximity itself was dangerous. And when Walter waved, my parents looked through him like he wasn't human, which, as a child, teaches you something ugly. It teaches you that erasing someone can be an acceptable form of control. My father built a 10-foot fence, the tallest code allowed, and he built it with a fury I'd never seen before, hammering posts into the ground like he was driving stakes into a coffin. And when it was finally finished, he stood back and said, "Now we don't have to see him," with the satisfaction of a man who believes sight is the same as truth. Then came the lawsuits, 3 of them, each one more petty than the last. A tree branch that hung a couple feet over the line, a harmless branch that could have been trimmed with one conversation. But my father hired a lawyer anyway, lost, appealed, lost again, and paid $8,000 for the privilege of losing. And when my mother asked if it was worth it, he said, "It's the principle," as if the principle was simply punishing Walter for existing. The second lawsuit was worse. It was over Walter's dog, Biscuit, a slow, old golden retriever whose joints looked like they ached with every step. My mother claimed Biscuit growled and lunged at her while she gardened, and I knew it was a lie because I'd seen Biscuit through gaps in the fence before it was reinforced. He could barely stand, yet the court ordered Walter to get rid of him. And I watched from my bedroom as animal control arrived, watched Walter carry Biscuit in his arms like he was carrying a dying child. watched him kiss the dog's head with tears streaming down his face before handing him over, and something in me cracked that night because I didn't have language for injustice yet, but I had the feeling of it. Sharp and permanent. The third lawsuit dragged on for 2 years over drainage, engineers, reports, paperwork, and Walter complied with everything without fighting back. He cut branches, altered landscaping, paid fines, and still stayed, which is the part no one ever explains to you when you're a kid. The so-called dangerous man never once acted dangerous. He absorbed cruelty like a sponge and kept breathing. I asked my mother, when I was 10, "Why do you hate him so much?" Because I'd caught her glaring out the kitchen window at his house with an expression that frightened me, and her face didn't flare with anger. It went cold, like a door slamming shut. She said, "He is a dangerous man. Marcus, you are never to speak to him, never to go near him, never to even look at him." And when I asked why, her voice sharpened into something that sounded like threat. Some things are not for children to understand. Trust your parents. Then, if I ever catch you talking to that man, there will be consequences, serious consequences. And I said yes, because kids say yes when adults turn fear into law, but I didn't obey completely. Because the first time I met Walter was an accident. I was 7, bored, lonely, throwing a tennis ball against the fence while my parents argued inside like they always did, and the ball hopped the fence into Walter's yard. I froze because that ball wasn't just a ball. My grandfather on my mother's side had given it to me before he died, and it felt like one of the only objects in my life with warmth attached to it. I dropped to my knees and found a small hole at the bottom of the fence, a missing knot in the wood, big enough to see through. And when I looked, Walter was sitting in a lawn chair reading, cardigan, slippers, cup of tea steaming beside him. And he didn't look dangerous. He looked lonely. He looked like the saddest person I'd ever seen. He sensed me and looked up, and our eyes met through that hole, and I braced for yelling, for proof my parents were right. But he smiled and said, gentle and raspy, "You lost something." And when I stammered, "My ball," he stood slowly, joints creaking, picked it up, and rolled it back through the hole with the care of someone returning a sacred object. "There you go, son." And I said, "Thank you." And he paused and said, "You're Marcus, right?" Like he already knew me. And when I said yes, he introduced himself. "I'm Walter. It's nice to finally meet you." Then he said the sentence that hooked itself in my chest for years. "You should listen to your parents. They only want what is best for you." But his eyes did something strange when he said it. Something like grief. And when I admitted, "My parents say I shouldn't talk to you," his face flickered, pain or resignation. Then he said, "Because you deserve kindness, Marcus. Every child deserves kindness, even if it's just a word through a fence." And I should have run back inside after that. I should have told my parents. But I didn't, because a child can recognize kindness the way a thirsty person recognizes water. And I was thirsty, so I went back the next day, and the next, and the hole in the fence became our secret, a secret that felt safer than my own house. We talked about school, history, books, the tiny dramas of childhood, and he listened like it mattered, like I mattered. He told me I had a curious mind, and that it was a gift, and not to lose it. And when he handed me small things through the hole, candy, a comic book, once a carved wooden bird he'd made himself, I hid them under my bed in a shoebox like contraband, terrified my parents would find them. But even the fear couldn't stop me, because Walter filled a silence my parents didn't even notice they'd created. And as I grew older, the conversation stretched. He celebrated my test scores, steadied me when I failed, guided me through adolescence without ever raising his voice, without ever using affection as leverage. And the strangest part is this: my parents were the ones who acted like predators, always monitoring, always controlling, always threatening consequences, and Walter was the one who behaved like family, patient, consistent, quietly present. So when I stood in that cemetery holding the envelope, feeling rain on my hands and a weight in my chest that didn't have a name yet, I didn't open it there. Not in the open. Not in front of strangers. I walked to my car and sat in the driver's seat for a long minute just staring at the paper, because some parts of your life you sense are about to divide into before and after. And if you've ever felt that moment, when the truth is right there but you're scared of what it will do to your world, type justice in the comments, because what I read next didn't just change what I knew about Walter, it exposed what my father spent 45 years burying. I opened the envelope in my car with my hands shaking so hard I had to grip the steering wheel for a second just to steady myself. The cemetery was quiet in that unnatural way, like even the birds were holding their breath, and the paper inside was covered in Walter's handwriting. The same careful slant I'd seen on the inside covers of the comic books he used to slide through the fence, the same handwriting that labeled the little wooden bird he carved for me, and seeing it there, addressed to my grandson Marcus, made my stomach drop so hard it felt like my body didn't believe what my eyes were reading, because that word, grandson, wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't sentiment. It was biology. It was blood. It was the kind of truth that immediately demands a new map of your entire life. Walter wrote that my father was his son, that Richard Webb had not always been Richard Webb, that he had been Richard Hartley, and for a full minute, I couldn't breathe. Because the entire foundation of everything I'd been told about my father's family collapsed in one sentence. My father had always said his parents were dead. No pictures, no stories, no graves we visited, nothing. It always felt odd in a small way, like a missing puzzle piece you learn to ignore. But now I understood why there were no photos, why there were no names, why the past in my house felt like a room my parents kept locked. Walter wrote that 45 years ago, my father did something terrible, something so terrible it split their lives into silence and exile. And he refused to write the details in the letter because he said the evidence was in his attic, in a box labeled, "The Truth." And he wrote that when he confronted my father and refused to stay silent, my father gave him a choice: keep quiet or lose him forever. And Walter couldn't live with it. So my father disappeared, changed his name, moved away, started a new identity, and told everyone his father was dead. And when I read that line, I felt something hot and sick rise in my throat, because it meant my parents didn't just hate Walter. They were terrified of what he represented. The living proof that my father's past wasn't clean. Walter wrote that he couldn't let me go, couldn't accept that his grandson would be erased along with him. So he sold everything and bought the house next door to keep me in sight, to watch me grow up from a distance, to love me in the only way he was allowed to. And that's when the fence stopped being just a fence in my memory. It became a prison wall my father built to keep me away from the one person who was telling the truth simply by existing. I sat there rereading the letter until my vision blurred, and the tears didn't feel like grief at first. They felt like shock, like my body trying to expel something poisonous. And the worst part wasn't the revelation that Walter was my grandfather. The worst part was realizing my father had spent my entire childhood training me to fear him, weaponizing my trust, turning kindness into contraband. And I thought about all the times my mother said dangerous, all the times my father said principle. And suddenly those words looked like masks, not morals. Masks, stretched over a secret. I drove straight to Walter's house, the same small Cape Cod that had always sat next door like a quiet witness. And the lawyer had given me keys because the house was mine now. Or at least it would be once the paperwork cleared, but calling it mine felt wrong. It had been Walter's whole life, his entire choice, the place he anchored himself so he wouldn't lose me. I walked in, and the house smelled like old books and tea and something faintly medicinal. The living room was exactly as I remembered from the few times I'd been inside as a teenager. Shelves of books, photos of places Walter had described in such detail. I'd practically lived them through his voice. And there was an absence too. The cat, Shadow, was gone. The chair by the fireplace felt empty, and that emptiness hit me harder than the grave, because graves are expected. Emptiness in a room still arranged for a living person feels like the universe making a mistake. I climbed the narrow attic stairs, and the air got colder. Dust thick in the sunlight, slanting through a small window, and there were boxes everywhere, furniture covered in sheets. The debris of decades, and then I saw it, a cardboard box with faded marker on the side. The truth. And my knees actually weakened, because Walter had written it like a promise. And here it was, waiting. I carried it down into the living room and set it on the rug in front of his armchair like I was placing an offering. And before I opened it, I sat there staring at it for a long time, because a part of me wanted to keep my life intact, even after reading the letter, wanted to pretend that knowledge alone was enough, that I didn't need details. But history doesn't work like that. Truth doesn't stop at the headline. It keeps going until you face the whole story. I poured myself a small glass of whiskey from a bottle I found in his kitchen. Not to be dramatic, but because my hands needed something to do. And then I opened the box. The first thing on top was a newspaper clipping from 1979, yellowed and brittle. A local paper from a town I'd never heard of. The headline said, "Hit and Run leaves young mother dead." And my eyes scanned the article like a student reading primary sources. A woman named Sarah Martinez, 28, struck by a vehicle while crossing the street. Late at night, driver fled. She died hours later. She left behind a husband and 2 children, a boy 7 and a girl 4. And I felt my stomach twist because those children were real people. They weren't a case. They weren't an incident. They were kids who went to bed and woke up without their mother because someone made a choice. I reached deeper into the box and found photos. Photos of a blue Ford Mustang with damage on the front passenger side. Photos of an intersection, skid marks, repair receipts paid in cash 2 days after the accident, and then a police report. And with every piece, the picture sharpened, not into speculation, but into a timeline, proof. And then I found the letter, my father's handwriting, dated 1979, addressed to Dad. The letter said he knew Walter knew, that he was drunk, that he didn't see her until it was too late, that he panicked and drove away, that he knew it was wrong, and then the line that made my skin go cold. "If you love me, you will keep this secret." And I stared at that sentence until my eyes burned, because it wasn't just confession, it was manipulation. It was a son trying to chain his father to his crime, using love as a leash. I found Walter's response too, the letter where he said he couldn't live with it, that he saw her children at the funeral, that Richard had to turn himself in, and Walter gave him a deadline. And then my father's reply, short, furious, threatening disappearance, name change, total severance, "You'll never meet my children." And reading that felt like being punched because I realized I had been used as a hostage before I was even born. My existence leveraged to silence a man who wanted justice. I stayed up all night in Walter's living room reading everything, like a man trying to absorb a hurricane through his eyes. And by morning, my understanding wasn't just that my father killed someone. It was that my father built an entire life on avoiding consequences, and my mother either knew or chose not to know, which is its own kind of violence. I drove home to my apartment in Hartford and tried to teach that day. Stood in front of sophomores explaining the Great Depression, while my head was full of a different kind of collapse, and every time I looked at my students, I saw Sarah Martinez's children, and I kept thinking, they deserve to know. They deserve justice, even if justice was late. That night I didn't sleep. I just stared at the ceiling, replaying every memory of my childhood through a new lens. The fence, the lawsuits, the hatred, all of it wasn't about Walter's danger. It was about Walter's proximity to the truth, and in that realization something solidified in me. Because if I kept quiet, if I tucked that box away, like my father had done for 45 years, then I would become part of the same lie, and I couldn't live in a lie anymore, not after Walter spent his life paying the price for refusing one. If you're still with me and you believe silence protects the guilty, type justice in the comments, because in the next part I'm going to tell you what happened when I walked back into my parents' house with that box and watched my father's face finally meet the past he thought he buried. I didn't confront my parents right away because the truth doesn't always explode. Sometimes it seeps. And for 3 days after I opened Walter's box, I lived in a kind of suspended reality, teaching classes, grading papers, answering emails, all while carrying a weight in my chest that made every normal interaction feel fake. I kept hearing Walter's voice in my head, not accusing, not bitter, just tired, and that tiredness scared me more than anger ever could, because anger burns fast, but tiredness is what you get when someone has been carrying the same truth for decades with nowhere to put it. And every night, I replayed the same question in my mind. What do you do when justice is overdue by 45 years? Do you still knock, or do you accept that some doors stay closed forever? I drove to my parents' house on the third night. The same house I grew up in. The same perfectly maintained suburban illusion, and the American flag by the door looked different now. Not patriotic, just performative. Like a costume worn to reassure neighbors, my mother answered the door with a surprised smile. Pleased even, because in her mind, a visit from me meant normalcy, meant control, meant the story was still intact. She said, "Your father's in his study, dinner will be ready soon," and the word dinner felt obscene in my mouth. I told her it could wait, that we needed to talk now, and something in my tone must have tipped her off, because her smile faltered just a bit. I walked into the study, and my father looked up from his book, older now, white hair, lined face, the kind of man people call respectable without asking why. He said, "This is a surprise," and I didn't sit. I dropped the box on his desk, Walter's box, the one labeled The Truth, and the sound it made was dull but final. My father's eyes went straight to it like a magnet, and I saw recognition flash across his face before he could stop it. "Where did you get that?" he asked, and his voice was already thin, already cracked. I said, "From my grandfather." And for the first time in my life, I saw my father look genuinely afraid, not angry, not controlling, afraid. He asked if Walter was dead, and I said yes, last week, and that I was the only one at his funeral. And when I said that, my voice shook because it was still raw, and my father said, "He was not your family," and something in me snapped. I said, "He was more family to me than you have ever been." And that's when my mother stepped into the room, apron still on, wooden spoon in her hand, confused and irritated, like she'd walked into a scene that disrupted her routine. She asked what was going on, and I said one name, Sarah Martinez. And the color drained from both of them at once. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't subtle. It was instant, like someone had turned off the lights behind their eyes. My father tried denial first, said he didn't know what I was talking about. So I pulled out the newspaper clipping and laid it on his desk. March 15th, 1979. Hit and run, mother of two, and he swallowed hard. And then I laid out the photos, the repair receipts, the police report, and finally the letter. His letter, his handwriting, his confession. And when he saw that he stopped pretending, he slumped into his chair like a man whose muscles had finally given up holding a lie upright. He said, "It was a long time ago, 45 years. And I said, That didn't make it smaller. It made it worse, because it meant he'd had 45 years to do the right thing and chose not to. He said it was an accident, that he was drunk and scared. And I said that leaving a woman dying in the street wasn't an accident, it was a decision. And when he said he was 23 and panicked, I said Sarah Martinez didn't get a second chance to be young or scared. She got hit and left alone. My mother was crying now. Real crying, not performative, and she kept saying she didn't know, that she never knew. And I honestly still don't know if that's true. But at that moment it didn't matter, because knowledge doesn't erase impact. My father said, if he'd gone to the police, his life would have been over. His career, everything he built. And I said, her life was over, her children's childhoods were over. Her husband drank himself to death, and he got barbecues and promotions and a clean conscience he didn't deserve. He said there was no statute of limitations, that legally it was manslaughter, and time had run out, and hearing him reduce a human life to a legal technicality made something cold settle in my stomach. Because that's what avoidance looks like after decades. It turns moral failure into paperwork. I told him I was taking the box and that I was going to find Sarah Martinez's children and tell them the truth. My mother begged me not to, said it would destroy the family, and I said the family was destroyed the night he drove away and left a woman on the road. The rest was just set dressing. My father said they wouldn't believe me, that it would be my word against his, and I said I had his confession, receipts, evidence, and a grandfather who spent 40 years building a case he never got to use. And when I walked out, my father didn't follow, he didn't shout, he didn't threaten. He just sat there, small, cornered by his own choices. And on the drive home, I felt something I didn't expect. Not triumph, not relief, but clarity, because for the first time in my life, the fear I grew up with made sense. The fence, the hatred, the lawsuits, they weren't about protecting me, they were about protecting him. And the next step wasn't revenge, it was responsibility, because if history is people making choices, then this was my moment to choose. I spent the next week doing what I teach my students to do. Research. I tracked down Sarah Martinez's children, Michael and Elena. Adults now, living ordinary lives shaped by an absence they never chose. And when I called Michael and said I had information about his mother's death, there was a silence so heavy I thought the line had gone dead. And then he said, they never found the driver. And I said, I know who it was. And we arranged to meet, and as I hung up the phone I thought about Walter, about how he waited 40 years to do this. And how the truth finally had legs, because he trusted me to carry it. If you believe justice doesn't expire just because time passes, type justice in the comments, because in the next part, I'm going to tell you what happened when I sat across from Sarah Martinez's children and handed them the truth my father tried to bury. We met in a small coffee shop just off the highway in Cleveland, the kind of place that tries too hard to feel cozy with exposed brick and chalkboard menus. But nothing about this meeting was comfortable. Michael Martinez arrived first. Tall, broad-shouldered, hands stained permanently with grease from years as a mechanic, his face lined in a way that spoke less about age and more about responsibility. Taken too early, Elena arrived 10 minutes later, smaller, softer, wearing scrubs under a jacket because she had come straight from a hospital shift, and when she hugged her brother before sitting down, I saw it immediately. That quiet shared language of siblings who grew up surviving the same loss. Neither of them smiled when they saw me, and I didn't expect them to. I introduced myself simply, Marcus Webb, and before I could say anything else, Michael said, "You said on the phone you know who killed our mother." Not raised, not aggressive, just flat, controlled. The way people speak when they're afraid of what the answer might do to them. I nodded and said yes. And that, I had proof, and Elena folded her hands together so tightly her knuckles went white. I slid the box across the table slowly. Walter's box. The one that had waited 40 years for this moment. And I told them everything, not all at once, but carefully, starting with Walter, the man next door, the grandfather I never knew I had, the hole in the fence, the years of quiet kindness. And as I spoke, I watched their expressions shift from confusion to disbelief, to something heavier, something closer to dread. Because when truth starts lining up with unanswered questions, it stops feeling hypothetical. Michael opened the box first, his movements deliberate, like he was afraid the contents might explode. He pulled out the newspaper clipping, and I watched his jaw tighten. Elena leaned in, her hand covering her mouth, and when they saw their mother's name in print, frozen in time at 28 years old, something broke open between them. Michael whispered, "That's her," like he needed to convince himself she was real again, that this wasn't just a story he'd grown up hearing secondhand. Then came the photos, my father's car, the damage, the repair receipts, and when Michael saw the date on those receipts, his hands started shaking, because suddenly the timeline wasn't abstract, it was precise, intentional, and cruel. Elena read the confession letter last, my father's handwriting, admitting everything, begging his father to protect him, and when she finished, she slid the paper back into the box very carefully, like it was something fragile and radioactive at the same time. She started crying silently, tears just falling without sound, and Michael stood up abruptly and walked outside. I let him go, because anger needs air, and when he came back 10 minutes later, his eyes were red but focused. He said, "All this time," and I knew exactly what he meant. All this time while they prayed, while they waited, while their father drank himself to death from grief, while they grew up learning to live with not knowing, my father lived a full, uninterrupted life. Not in a performative way, not as a proxy apology for my father, but because I was part of the system that benefited from silence. Even if I didn't know it at the time, Michael asked me why I was doing this, why I would destroy my own father, and I told him about Walter, about the choice he made between justice and his son, about the fence, the lawsuits, the decades of punishment for trying to do the right thing, and I said that if Walter had taught me anything, it was that silence protects the wrong people. Elena asked quietly if anything could still be done legally, and that question hung there. Because the truth is messy, I explained the statute of limitations, that criminal prosecution was unlikely, but that civil court was still an option, that public truth was still an option, that consequences don't always come in handcuffs. Sometimes they come in daylight. Michael nodded slowly, and I could see resolve setting in. Not rage, not revenge. Resolve, the kind that doesn't burn out quickly, the kind that lasts. We talked for hours. About their mother, about who she was, about the way she laughed, about the way she sang in the kitchen, about the hole her death left that never quite closed. And when we finally stood to leave, Elena hugged me, tight, unexpected, and said, "Thank you for telling us." And I realized then that justice isn't about making things even, it's about restoring dignity, about refusing to let a life be erased by convenience. The fallout came fast after that. Michael and Elena filed a civil suit, not because they expected money, but because they wanted a legal record, a paper trail that said out loud what everyone had been forced to whisper for decades. The press picked it up, first local, then national, because the story had everything people latch onto. A hit and run, a cover-up, a family that turned cruelty into a lifestyle, and a grandfather who waited 40 years to tell the truth. My father's reputation collapsed under the weight of it. Friends disappeared, neighbors avoided eye contact. The same community that once applauded his lawsuits against Walter suddenly remembered them with shame. My mother moved out, quietly, without drama, and I inherited Walter's house, the one next door, the one that had been a front row seat to my childhood. I moved in, and the first thing I did was tear down the fence. Every post, every board, every barrier my father had built to keep truth out and fear in. The grass grew back quickly, like it had been waiting. I found more of Walter in that house, journals filled with observations about me, notes about my first report card, my first heartbreak, my graduation, moments he never got to attend but never missed, and reading them was like meeting him all over again, not as the quiet man next door, but as someone who loved me fiercely and anonymously. Michael and Elena visit sometimes now. We sit at Walter's old kitchen table and talk about Sarah, about what she would have been like as a grandmother, about how strange it is that tragedy made us something like family. And when I visit Walter's grave every Sunday, I tell him he did it, that the truth is out, that the fence is gone, that the choice he made didn't disappear into nothing. If you believe that telling the truth matters, even when it's late, even when it costs everything, type justice in the comments, because in the next part I'm going to tell you about the final letter my father sent me after his world collapsed, and why forgiveness is harder than anger when you finally understand the full weight of what someone has done. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, slipped under my door like it was ashamed to knock. A plain white envelope with my name written in my father's careful, familiar handwriting, the same handwriting I had seen confessing to a crime he ran from for 45 years, and I stared at it for a long time before picking it up, because there is something uniquely heavy about words were rehearsed in guilt before they were written. I already knew what it would say in broad strokes: sorrow, regret, explanation, the quiet hope that time might soften what truth had finally sharpened. But knowing doesn't make reading easier. I sat at Walter's old kitchen table, the one where he used to drink tea and talk to me about history and choice and consequence. And I opened it there because it felt right that whatever my father had to say would be read in the presence of the man he spent his life trying to erase. The letter was long, 4 pages, tightly written, and it started the way I expected. "Marcus, I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need to write it anyway." And then it unfolded into a lifetime of justification, disguised as remorse. He wrote about fear, about being young, about panic, about the weight of one mistake spiraling into 1,000 others. He wrote about how he convinced himself that silence was a kind of mercy, that confessing would only reopen wounds, that staying quiet was a way of protecting everyone involved, including the children who lost their mother. Because in his mind, knowing would only hurt them more. And reading that made something twist in my chest, because that is how lies survive. They dress themselves up as kindness and call it compassion. He wrote about Walter, about his father's stubborn morality, about how he felt judged, cornered, abandoned, and how changing his name felt like survival, not betrayal. He said he never stopped feeling guilty, that it haunted him, that every siren made his heart race, that every knock on the door felt like the end. And part of me believed him, because guilt doesn't always make people better. Sometimes it just makes them more careful. He said he knew I might never forgive him, but that he hoped I would understand, that he hoped someday we could talk. And when I finished the letter, I folded it carefully and put it back in the envelope. Not because I respected it, but because I didn't want to tear it in anger. Anger gives people an excuse to stop listening. And what I was feeling was heavier than anger. It was grief. Grief for the father I thought I had. Grief for the man he could have been if he had chosen differently. Grief for the grandfather who paid the price for someone else's cowardice. I didn't write back right away. Forgiveness isn't a response you mail. It's a process you live through. And some processes don't have deadlines. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a strange new normal. The press cycle moved on like it always does. Outrage burns hot and fast, and then the world looks for the next thing to consume. But the consequences didn't disappear. Michael and Elena's civil case moved forward quietly, methodically. Not fueled by spectacle but by documentation, my father avoided trial by settling, the terms confidential but meaningful, and more importantly, the truth was now public record. Sarah Martinez's name no longer buried in a cold case archive, but spoken aloud in courtrooms and articles and conversations that finally acknowledged what was taken from her. My mother called once, hesitant, unsure, her voice smaller than I remembered. She said she didn't know how to be my mother anymore, that everything she believed about her life felt unstable. And I told her that instability was the cost of truth. That's what happens when a lie collapses. It doesn't just fall inward, it shakes everything around it. We talked carefully, like people walking across cracked ice, and I realized something unexpected, that accountability doesn't always destroy relationships. Sometimes it just strips them down to something more honest. I spent more time in Walter's house, learning its rhythms, fixing things he had let go, planting flowers in the yard he used to tend. And every small act felt like a conversation with him, like finishing sentences he never got to complete. I found more journals, more notes, evidence of a man who lived a full emotional life in silence, and one line stayed with me more than any other. Written years ago in shaky ink, loving from a distance is still loving, but it should never have to be. That line felt like both a confession and an indictment, and it made me think about forgiveness in a way I hadn't before. Forgiveness isn't about absolving someone of responsibility. It's about deciding what kind of person you want to be in the aftermath of their failure. And I wasn't there yet. Maybe I never would be. But I knew one thing. I wasn't going to carry my father's secret the way Walter carried it. I wasn't going to sacrifice truth for comfort, even my own. Michael and Elena came over one evening with their families, their children running across the open grass where the fence once stood. Laughing, free, and watching that felt like something closing a circle that had been open for decades. They told stories about Sarah, about her stubbornness, her warmth, the way she danced in the kitchen, and I told stories about Walter, about his kindness, his patience, his quiet strength, and it struck me then that legacy isn't about blood alone. It's about who shapes you, who teaches you how to stand when things are hard, and Walter chose to shape me even when it cost him everything. That kind of love deserves to be honored, not hidden. One night, weeks later, I finally wrote my father back, not with forgiveness, not with condemnation, but with clarity. I told him I received his letter, that I understood his fear, but did not accept his justification, that remorse without accountability is just another form of self-protection, and that if he wanted any chance at reconciliation, it would have to start with owning what he did publicly and without condition. I didn't know if he would, and honestly, I wasn't sure I cared anymore, because the truth was no longer trapped between us. It was out in the open, where it belonged. If you believe forgiveness should never be demanded before justice is acknowledged, type justice in the comments, because in the next part I'm going to tell you what happened the day I finally visited Sarah Martinez's grave, and why closure doesn't come from forgetting. It comes from remembering the right things for the right reasons. I visited Sarah Martinez's grave on a Sunday morning because that felt appropriate, quiet, respectful, the kind of time when the world isn't rushing past your grief. The cemetery was older than I expected. The headstones uneven and weathered, names fading into stone like memories people assume time will take care of on its own. Michael had given me the plot number and directions, but I still walked slowly, reading markers as I went, because walking through a cemetery has a way of reminding you how many stories end without resolution. When I found her headstone, it was simple, modest, her name, her dates, nothing else. No epitaph, no message about love or legacy, just a woman reduced to coordinates and stone. And standing there, I felt the full weight of what had been stolen. Not just her life, but the years she never got to live. the moments she never got to have with her children, the ordinary Tuesdays that never happened. I knelt down and placed the flowers I brought. White lilies because I didn't know her favorite and didn't want to guess. And I spoke out loud even though no one was there, because silence had already done enough damage in this story. I told her who I was, that I was the grandson of the man who loved her children from a distance without knowing them, that I was the son of the man who killed her and ran. And saying those words felt like swallowing broken glass, but I said them anyway. Because truth spoken aloud has power, I told her that her children knew now, that they hadn't been forgotten, that the story of her death was no longer a mystery people shrugged at. And I apologized. Not because apologies fix anything, but because acknowledgement matters, because pretending harm didn't happen is what allowed it to rot for 45 years. When I stood to leave, I noticed something that caught me off guard. A small carved bird placed near the base of the stone. Wooden, smooth, unmistakably handmade. Michael later told me Elena's son had left it there after hearing about Walter, carving something for someone he never met, because he understood instinctively what it meant to make something with your hands for love. And that moment stayed with me, because it meant the story didn't just end in loss, it extended forward into meaning. In the weeks after, I spoke at my classes differently. History stopped being something I taught from textbooks and became something I lived. I talked to my students about moral courage, about how the hardest choices don't usually announce themselves as heroic, they arrive disguised as inconvenience, as fear, as the temptation to look away. And I told them that every generation inherits unresolved truths from the one before it. And the question isn't whether those truths exist, it's whether you'll carry them forward or finally set them down. I didn't tell them my story, not directly, but I saw it land, because teenagers understand injustice more than adults give them credit for. They just want to know someone will name it honestly. My father didn't contact me again for a while. And when he did, it wasn't with excuses, it was with distance. He moved to Florida, far from the neighborhood that once applauded him, far from the fence he built, far from the evidence that finally caught up to him. He told me he was tired, and for the first time I believed him, not tired from guilt, but tired from pretending, from carrying a lie so long it fused to his identity. My mother stayed in Connecticut, closer to me now than she had ever been emotionally. She started therapy, something she once dismissed as indulgent, and watching her confront her own complicity was uncomfortable but necessary, because accountability doesn't stop with the person who commits the act, it ripples outward to everyone who benefits from silence. Michael and Elena's civil case settled quietly, not because they wanted to move on, but because justice doesn't always need a spotlight to exist. What mattered more was the public record, the acknowledgement, the correction of history, the name of the man who killed their mother attached to the truth at last. And something unexpected happened after that. People began reaching out to me, strangers, emails and letters, people who had grown up with secrets, with family myths that never quite added up. People who suspected something wrong but didn't know how to ask, how to look, how to confront. And they thanked me for telling the story, not because it was dramatic, but because it was honest, because it gave them permission to question the narratives they were handed, to dig, to demand better. And that's when I understood Walter's choice in a new way. He wasn't just protecting justice. He was protecting the future, protecting the idea that truth, even delayed, still matters. One evening, Michael invited me to dinner. His family gathered around a table, loud with laughter and overlapping conversation. And for the first time, I felt what chosen family really means. Not obligation, not blood alone, but shared values, shared grief, shared commitment to doing better than what came before. Elena raised a glass and toasted to Walter, calling him the bravest man she never met. And we all drank to that. And I realized that closure isn't a moment, it's a practice. It's choosing again and again, not to look away, not to excuse, not to shrink from uncomfortable truths. I still visit Walter's grave every Sunday, and now, sometimes I stop by Sarah's too. Not because I owe her anything, but because remembrance is a form of justice. And as I stand there, I think about the fence that once divided truth from fear, and how easy it would have been to leave it standing, how tempting it would have been to tell myself it was too late, that nothing could change. But fences don't just keep things out, they keep things in, and tearing them down is the only way air gets through. If you believe justice doesn't belong to the clock, that truth doesn't expire, type justice in the comments, because in the next part I'm going to talk about the hardest decision I made after all of this. Whether forgiveness is something you give someone else or something you give yourself. Forgiveness sounds simple when people talk about it from a distance, like it's a switch you flip once enough time has passed, like saying the word out loud somehow dissolves the harm underneath it. But when you're standing in the wreckage of someone else's choices, forgiveness stops being abstract and starts feeling like a negotiation with your own conscience, because forgiving too quickly feels like betrayal, and refusing to forgive at all feels like letting anger finish the job. Injustice started, and after everything came out, that was the space I lived in. Not rage, not peace, but tension. I kept replaying Walter's life in my mind. 40 years lived in the shadow of someone else's crime, 40 years of watching from behind a fence, of choosing love without recognition. And I asked myself over and over whether forgiveness would honor him or erase what he endured. My father wrote again, shorter this time. No explanations. No self-defense, just an acknowledgement. He said he was sorry without asking for anything in return, and that mattered more than the pages he wrote before. But it still wasn't enough to answer the question that haunted me. What do you owe someone who stole a life and then stole decades more by hiding it? I talked about it with Michael and Elena one night after dinner, because they were the only people who could understand both sides of the loss. Michael said forgiveness didn't interest him, not because he wanted revenge, but because forgiveness felt like closure he hadn't earned. Elena was quieter. She said forgiveness wasn't for her father's sake. It was for her own, because carrying anger had shaped her life in ways she didn't choose. And listening to them, I realized forgiveness isn't a single thing. It's a spectrum. And where you land depends on what you need to survive. I thought about my students, about the way we teach history, as if the past is sealed, when in reality, it bleeds forward, shaping families, neighborhoods, entire generations. And I thought about the example I wanted to set, not as a son, but as a human being. I didn't want my life to be defined by reacting to my father's crime. I wanted it to be defined by refusing to replicate his pattern. He chose silence to protect himself. I chose truth even when it cost me comfort. And maybe forgiveness wasn't the final chapter. Maybe it was something that could only come after accountability had been fully lived with, not just acknowledged. I went back to Walter's journals, rereading passages I had skimmed before, and one entry stopped me cold, written years earlier. I have forgiven my son in my heart, not because he deserves it, but because I refuse to let his failure turn me into someone I don't recognize. Forgiveness didn't stop Walter from seeking justice. It didn't make him complicit. It simply kept him human, and that distinction changed everything for me. Forgiveness wasn't about letting my father off the hook. It was about refusing to let his crime turn me bitter, cold, or small. A week later, I met my father in person for the first time since the confrontation. A neutral place, a park near the water, public enough to keep things grounded, private enough to speak honestly. He looked older than his years, not from age, but from the collapse of the persona he'd been hiding behind. He didn't try to explain himself. He didn't argue. He listened, and that was new. I told him about Walter's journals, about the fence, about the wooden bird at Sarah's grave, about Michael and Elena. And I told him I wasn't there to forgive him. Not yet. Maybe not ever, but I was there to tell him that I wouldn't carry his secret or his shame anymore. That belonged to him, and for the first time I saw something in his eyes that looked like understanding. Not relief, not gratitude, understanding. And when I left that meeting, I felt lighter. Not because I'd forgiven him, but because I'd stopped negotiating with his guilt. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't an obligation. It's a choice you make when you're ready, and readiness doesn't come from pressure. It comes from clarity. I don't know if I'll ever forgive my father in the way people expect, but I know this. I won't let his worst act define my entire life, and that in itself feels like a victory Walter would recognize. If you believe forgiveness should never erase accountability, type justice in the comments, because in the next part, I'm going to talk about what happens after truth and accountability, how you build something honest on ground that was poisoned for decades, and why tearing down a fence is only the beginning. Building something honest on ground that was poisoned for decades is harder than exposing a lie. Because exposure is an event, and rebuilding is a process, and once the truth was out and the headlines faded and the court filings settled into archives, I was left with a quieter question that didn't announce itself so dramatically. What now? What do you do with a life that was shaped by secrecy? Once the secrecy is gone, I moved fully into Walter's house, not as a symbolic gesture but because it felt right to inhabit the space where so much silent love had lived, and the first weeks were unsettling. Every creak of the floorboards, every shelf of books, every half-finished project felt like a conversation, paused mid-sentence. I painted rooms, fixed broken hinges, replaced things he had let go as his body weakened, and each repair felt like an act of respect. Not erasing him, but continuing what he started. I found myself thinking about how environments shape people, how growing up behind a fence taught me caution and observation, how kneeling in the grass to talk through a hole taught me patience, how loving someone you're not allowed to acknowledge teaches restraint. And I realized that Walter hadn't just loved me, he had trained me, quietly, to survive truth, to sit with complexity without flinching. That skill mattered now more than ever, because rebuilding relationships after truth isn't about pretending things are fine. It's about deciding what can be rebuilt and what has to stay broken. My relationship with my mother existed in that fragile, in-between space. We talked more than we ever had, but carefully, circling topics instead of diving headfirst. She carried her own guilt, not for the crime itself, but for the years of cruelty she aimed at the man next door, without ever asking why. And watching her confront that was uncomfortable, because remorse looks different when it's earned late. Sometimes it's clumsy, sometimes it's self-focused, but it's still necessary. And I let it exist without rushing it, because rushing healing creates the same kind of damage as rushing forgiveness. Michael and Elena became regular presences in my life, not in a dramatic way, just shared dinners, birthdays, holidays that felt improvised but sincere, and something unexpected happened in those ordinary moments. I stopped feeling like a witness to their grief and started feeling like a participant in their resilience. We talked about Sarah not as a victim frozen in time, but as a person with flaws and humor and habits, and reclaiming her humanity felt like the most important form of justice. Because crime stories tend to flatten people into symbols, but families remember details. The way she laughed too loudly, the way she sang off key, the way she rushed through crosswalks like the world owed her a favor. Those details mattered because they reminded us that she wasn't an abstract loss. She was a life interrupted. I also found myself changing how I taught. Not just content, but posture. I stopped presenting history as something safely behind glass and started treating it like a living argument between past and present. I challenged my students to ask uncomfortable questions, to look at whose voices were missing, whose stories were buried under convenience, and they responded. Because young people recognize injustice, even when adults pretend not to. They don't need it simplified. They need it named. One afternoon after class, a student stayed behind and asked how you live. Knowing someone you love did something unforgivable, and I didn't answer right away. Because there isn't a clean answer, but I told him, you don't live with it. You live past it. You refuse to let it define the boundaries of who you become. And that seemed to land. The fence between the properties became a recurring image in my mind, not just a physical structure, but a symbol of how families manage shame, build barriers, redirect anger, and when I tore it down, neighbors asked questions. Casual ones, curious ones, and for the first time, I didn't deflect. I didn't protect the narrative. I told them the truth simply and without embellishment. And watching their reactions was revealing. Some were shocked, some were defensive, some quietly ashamed, but all of them had to adjust their understanding of a man they thought they knew. And that adjustment mattered. Because community complicity is part of how lies survive, my father's absence became permanent in a way that surprised me, not because he disappeared physically, but because the role he occupied in my life no longer existed. I didn't miss him the way I thought I would. Because what I missed wasn't him. It was the idea of a father he never truly was. And letting go of that illusion felt like mourning someone who never existed, a strange but necessary grief. I started volunteering with a local restorative justice group. Not because I believed in neat resolutions, but because I believed in accountability that doesn't end with punishment. Listening to people wrestle honestly with harm they caused or endured reinforced something Walter taught me without ever saying it, that justice isn't about spectacle, it's about alignment. Aligning truth with consequence, memory with dignity, action with values. And in quieter moments, alone in the house at night, I felt Walter's presence not as a ghost but as a standard. A quiet reminder of the kind of endurance that doesn't demand recognition. The kind that just stays. If you believe rebuilding after truth is harder than uncovering it, if you believe tearing down a fence is only the first step and not the last, type justice in the comments. Because in the next part, I'm going to tell you about the moment I finally understood what Walter meant when he said, "Some breaks heal and some do not," and how you learn to live honestly with both. I finally understood what Walter meant about breaks not always healing on an ordinary afternoon. Not during a confrontation or a revelation, but while doing something mundane. I was fixing a loose step on the back porch, replacing a board that had rotted from years of rain. And as I worked, I noticed the wood underneath was still dark and warped. Even after the damaged piece was removed, the surface problem was easy to replace. But the deeper damage had soaked in, and standing there with a hammer in my hand, it clicked. Some things can be repaired to function again, but they never return to their original shape, and pretending otherwise only leads to collapse later. My relationship with my father was like that. Functional contact might be possible someday, but the shape of trust it once had was gone for good, and accepting that wasn't failure, it was realism. Walter had lived with that understanding for 40 years, loving without illusion, staying without expectation, and I finally grasped the quiet strength that required. I thought about how often we pressure ourselves to repair things simply because they existed before, as if longevity alone grants value. But Walter never tried to rebuild what was broken between him and his son. He acknowledged it honestly and chose a different kind of connection, one that didn't rely on denial. And that realization freed me from a burden I didn't know I was carrying. I stopped measuring my progress by whether reconciliation might happen, and started measuring it by whether my actions aligned with my values. Michael and Elena noticed the shift before I did. They said I seemed lighter, more present, less guarded, and they were right. Because clarity creates space. Space to grieve properly, space to remember without anger clouding every thought, space to imagine a future not defined by reaction. We visited Sarah's grave together on the anniversary of her death, not as a ritual of sorrow but as an acknowledgement of continuity. Her grandchildren came too, curious. asking questions in the unfiltered way children do. And Elena told them the truth, in age-appropriate words, that their grandmother was kind and funny and taken too soon, and that sometimes grown-ups make terrible choices that hurt other people. And watching that honesty unfold felt like the opposite of everything I grew up with. No euphemisms, no walls, no fences, just truth delivered with care. That was healing, not erasing pain, but contextualizing it, giving it a place where it could exist without poisoning everything else. Later that night, Michael and I talked about our fathers, about inherited patterns, about the fear of repeating mistakes, and he said something that stayed with me. He said, "Our kids will inherit something from us no matter what. The only choice is whether it's silence or honesty." And that felt like the thesis of everything Walter lived by. Honesty doesn't guarantee peace, but silence guarantees harm. My students noticed the difference too. One asked why history always seems to repeat itself, and I told them it doesn't repeat, it echoes. And echoes only fade when someone changes the pattern. That line came from Walter, even if he never said it outright. My mother continued therapy. And one evening she admitted something she'd never said before, that her cruelty toward Walter wasn't just loyalty to my father, it was fear. Fear that if she questioned the story, she'd lose the life she depended on. And hearing that didn't excuse her behavior, but it explained it. And understanding doesn't absolve, it informs. It helps you decide where boundaries need to be. And for me, that boundary was clear. Truth was non-negotiable. Any relationship going forward had to exist in daylight. No more shadows. My father sent one final message months later, not asking for forgiveness, not defending himself, just acknowledging that he understood why he would never be fully welcomed back into my life. And for the first time, his words didn't provoke anger or sadness, just acceptance. Some breaks don't heal, but they also don't have to define you. Walter's life taught me that staying doesn't always mean proximity. Sometimes it means consistency, values lived quietly over time. And as I stood in the backyard where the fence once stood, watching sunlight move freely across open grass, I felt something close to peace. Not because everything was fixed, but because nothing was hidden anymore. If you believe clarity is more powerful than closure, that honesty matters more than comfort, type justice in the comments. Because in the final part, I'm going to tell you what legacy really means when bloodlines fail, and why the family you choose can sometimes be the truest one you'll ever know. Legacy is a word people like to use when they want to make something permanent feel noble. But after everything I lived through, I understand it differently now. Legacy isn't what you leave behind when you die. It's what you pass forward while you're still here. It's the habits you model, the truths you protect, the lines you refuse to cross, even when crossing them would make life easier. And standing in Walter's backyard on a quiet evening, watching the light fade across grass that used to be divided by a fence, I finally understood what kind of legacy he left me. Not property, not money, not even answers, but a way of living honestly in a world that rewards silence. Walter lost his son because he chose truth, but he gained something else in return. He became the man who refused to look away. And that refusal shaped me more than my father ever did. I live in Walter's house now, not as an act of defiance, but as an act of continuity. The rooms are different, updated, lived in, but the spirit remains. Books still line the walls, conversations still matter here. Truth still has a seat at the table. Michael and Elena's families come over often, our children running through the yard where barriers once stood. And watching them play feels like a quiet victory, not over my father, not over the past, but over the idea that harm has the final word. It doesn't, not if someone interrupts the pattern. My students ask me sometimes why I never changed careers after everything that happened, why I stayed teaching history when my own history turned out to be so heavy. And the answer is simple, because history is where patterns get named. And once you can name a pattern, you can choose whether to repeat it or break it. I teach them now that courage doesn't always look like action. Sometimes, it looks like patience. Like Walter's 40 years of watching, waiting, documenting, loving without applause. I tell them that justice doesn't belong to the clock. That time passing doesn't make wrongs right. It just tests whether anyone still cares enough to speak. My relationship with my father remains distant and honest. We are not close, and we may never be, but we exist without lies now, and that matters more than reconciliation built on denial. My mother and I are rebuilding slowly, carefully, with boundaries that didn't exist before, and that too is part of legacy, deciding what gets repaired and what remains broken without pretending both outcomes are the same. I visit Walter's grave every Sunday still, and now, sometimes Sarah's too, because remembering is an act of resistance. It resists erasure. It resists convenience. It resists the urge to move on without learning anything. I talk to Walter like he can hear me, about ordinary things, about my week, about my students, about moments that make me laugh, and sometimes I thank him for staying, for choosing the harder road when the easier one was right there. And when I leave, I don't feel sadness the way I used to. I feel alignment, like my life is finally pointed in the same direction as my values, and that alignment is peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting, but the kind that comes from knowing you didn't betray the truth when it asked something of you. People still ask me if I regret what I did, if exposing my father was worth the fallout, the loss, the reshaping of everything I thought my family was, and the answer never changes. Yes, it was worth it, because the alternative was living inside a lie that would have shaped every choice I made without my consent. Walter spent 40 years paying the price for someone else's crime because he refused to accept that alternative. And the least I could do was finish what he started. Legacy isn't about perfection. Walter wasn't perfect. He made choices that cost him dearly, but he chose the right cost. And that's what I carry forward. When people ask me who my family is now, I don't hesitate. It's the people who show up in daylight, the people who tell the truth even when it hurts, the people who choose justice over comfort. Again and again, blood doesn't entitle anyone to silence. Love doesn't require lies, and loyalty that demands injustice isn't loyalty at all. It's fear wearing a familiar face. The fence is gone. The secrets are out. And somewhere I like to believe Walter is at peace, knowing that the truth he protected didn't die with him. It lived. It moved. It mattered. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that truth deserves daylight no matter how long it's been buried, type justice in the comments, not for me, but for every story that's still waiting for someone brave enough to tell it. And if you want to hear more stories about people who chose truth when silence would have been easier, they're on your screen now. Choose the one that calls to you. And remember this: your story matters, even if someone tried to erase it.